LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of domestic violence, suicide, and violent crime. Please listen with care. All before her 25th birthday, forensic chemist Maggie Baron had held the hands of killers, armed robbers, and violent offenders, not in comfort, but in the name of science. And when her husband died after a long illness, and under suspicious circumstances, it was Maggie who was tasked with searching for traces of poison, with a suspected killer looking over her shoulder. In this episode, Maggie reveals what it's like to be alone in a room with someone who's just ended another person's life, and unpacks an arsenic poisoning investigation that reads more like fiction than fact. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
Look, it's quite interesting. In fact, I wasn't drawn to a career in forensic science. So I got my first job in there in very early 1981. I had my 21st birthday at Forensic, and it was a drugs analysis role, and I was basically analysing the summer harvest of cannabis. It was just a job advertised. I was at Monash Uni. I'd just finished my 4 years of study, and there was just a job up on the jobs board. So I had a chat with my professor, and I said, look, I'm probably going to need to get a job. And he said, yeah, go have a look at that one. And there you go. So it was a 3-month contract, which led to another 3-month contract, which led to a 6-month contract, eventually led to an ongoing job in trace evidence.
So can you take us back to the afternoon of August the 9th, 1984, and you were on your way to your first solo job. How were you feeling?
Well, it was a very difficult time for me. So the scenario was that I was working in the trace evidence section, and I'd been working closely with our team leader, Peter Ross, and being trained to do the gunshot residue analyses on people thought to have been involved in discharging a firearm. Now, Peter had gone down the country somewhere, probably a court case, but could have been another case, honestly, don't recall. I'm in the tea room, and our next boss up the food chain, also called a Peter, came in and asked me, or basically directed me to go down to whichever the police station was to take samples from 2 suspects in a shooting case. Actually, it was an armed robbery. I had never done any solo. I'd done stuff, I'd taken samples on my own, but Peter was always there. So I felt pretty cross about it at the time. I felt very pressured. I didn't have anywhere to go. And I remember also he made a comment about, it's better than dealing with a corpse or a dead body. At least they're alive. And to be honest, I saw some pretty graphic dead bodies, but I always found the live people far more challenging to deal with. The fact that he didn't even offer to accompany me was pretty awful. So I would have been 24, sitting in the back seat of probably a marked police car, might have been unmarked, and being driven down to the other end of town to go in and take samples from these 2 armed robbers, Luffnan and James.
And at the time, you didn't actually know who they were, but later you found out these were probably 2 of the most notorious armed robbers in the state.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that was always a hallmark of the work as a forensic scientist for me. We were very much insulated from a lot of the background stories of the crimes that we're getting involved with for all absolutely good reason. But what it means is that, sometimes you turned up and you didn't really know what you're going to be seeing. And these 2 guys were, they looked as though they'd been brutalised during their arrest. They were pretty angry. I was really mindful that those sort of folks who, discharge guns as armed robbers, after the fact, they're still really simmering. They've still got this anger burning. So not only have they been caught out and they're not going to get to take the money home and do what they felt they needed it for, but they've been caught by the police. And now they're going to go down a pretty severe path of the judicial system and probably end up in jail. So they're really simmering and angry, as opposed to people involved in murdering their partners' wives mostly, yeah.
So is that aggression something that feels palpable in the room?
Yeah, it does. And, you know, I'm there. I'm just in my civilian clothing. I probably had a lab coat on. I've got a little bag with the various swabs that I need to collect the samples. I'm led into the room. They're in two separate rooms. They're no doubt being interviewed while they're not with me. And I effectively have to ask them permission to take the samples because there wasn't a legal requirement. They didn't have to consent. So I say, oh, hello, my name's Margaret Baron. I go by Maggie now, but my name's Margaret Baron. I'm a forensic scientist and I'm here to collect samples from your hands. I've got a very dilute acid solution. It will not cause you any irritation. Is that okay? Or something along those lines.
So when you were in the room with them, you didn't know who they were. But can you tell us what you later found out about these two men?
Yes, certainly. So these guys were very entrenched. They had a long history of very violent activities. So Luffnan, who I just knew them as Luffnan and James, I didn't really go by first names, and Luffnan had first gone into the prison system with mental health issues as a youngster before he graduated to the adult situation. And James, he was a long-term inmate of H Division. So H Division in Pentridge was where they kept all the hardcore crooks. And he was a member of Chopper Reed's gang, I think it was called the Overcoat Gang, and he'd been suspected of setting fire to another prisoner. So that was Barry Quinn. They were really hardcore, you know, and once you've murdered people, I'm sure it just gets easier and easier. So you do, you know, I was actually really relieved to not know who these people were and what their CVs were at the time that I was dealing with them on my own, because the police sort of led me into the room and left me there. They then went off and got a cup of coffee or a glass of water or went to have another chat with the other person who I wasn't sampling from at the time.
And how did you manage your fear at the time?
Look, it's a really good question. I think that in reality, you can either, you know, stump yourself up for these situations or not. You know, there were any number of people who went through the trace evidence area in my time who could not do the on-call work. They could not deal with the deceased. Most of them wouldn't even go and deal with a living suspect. So I don't know. I think I've always had a capacity to dig very deep, but I also know that I've relied on very systematic approaches. So, you know, I double check everything's in the black box before I go so that I've got enough swabs, I've got the dilute acid, I've got my gloves, I've got the notebooks, all these things that I'll need to rely on. You know, even though I was there doing it on my own for the first time, I had done the work before, I knew what to do. I think I just understood that these are really violent people. They're not going anywhere fun for a long time. And my job is just to be calm, really clear, and I don't have to get them over the line. If they declined, didn't consent to have the samples taken, that's fine. That's not my problem. You know, I think I understood very clearly where the demarcation lines were. So, yeah, I was just, and honestly, they probably thought it was even far less onerous, whatever I was doing, because I'm a young girl in her early 20s, well, young woman in her early 20s. So I wouldn't have had anywhere near that sort of gravitas or bulk of a well-seasoned armed robbery squad detective.
And can you tell us exactly what you were looking for?
Back in the early 80s, we are looking specifically for a group of chemicals that are normally contained in the primer of a bullet. So the primer is the bit that explodes when the hammer hits the back of the bullet and it sends the projectile, normally lead, out through the gun. So it's antimony, lead and barium are the three compounds that are associated with the primer, and they're normally in discrete particles with a blend, a mixture of each of these compounds because of the heat. It volatilizes and then it cools to a little metal glob, microscopic globs. But in the case where I was sampling these guys, we didn't have the sophistication that came later of the electron microscope. So we're looking for the components of this primer residue. And it's on the hands of people when they discharge a gun. And if you look at anything, if you looked at a gun being discharged, you'll see the sort of puff of smoke, and it's that material that is settling on the hands of whoever has fired a gun.
And what was the test that actually showed the elements were there? Was that under the microscope or was that something else?
No, so it wasn't. It was atomic absorption spectroscopy, where you were basically putting the solution into that spectrograph, which would settle out the componentry based on the weight of the atom, and you would get a chart. And the chart would show a proportion of barium to lead to antimony, and there were indicative patterns. .22 rifles, though, for instance, commonly don't have much barium or much of the antimony. Antimony is a more rare material, so they might be just lead, which doesn't mean it's not gunshot residue, but you have to be able to understand that and interpret that for a court.
Now, you were often left alone with these offenders or suspected offenders when you were examining their hands. Why was that, do you think?
Look, I think in different cases, I think on one level it's very much about a degree of comfort that the police have. So when you think about policing and policing in these particular task forces, units, squads, they're really familiar with this stuff. You know, they all know these armed robbers, for instance. And, you know, I think there's sort of little sayings like, oh, you have to think like an armed robber to catch an armed robber. So I think they're just incredibly comfortable. And I think part of it is they don't think there's any risk for me. It's in a police station. I'm safe. I wouldn't be surprised if they also want to step back because they don't want to arouse the emotions of these armed robbers either. And as I said earlier, being just a young woman, I think they just thought, oh, well, she'll just hop in there and do what she does. And, you know, I'm literally only there for about 15 minutes for each of the people, you know, sampling from each hand separately. So, yeah, I think they just thought, I don't think they thought anything of it, although they were meant to keep us company, not least of which is what would I do if one of these people started making a confession or giving evidence? I'm not really in a position to capture that information, and yet by de facto I'm in the room, so I'm hearing it, so I can't unhear it, and that could be a potential difficulty.
In your time at the lab, you were also called upon to examine the hands of dead victims. That could be very traumatic. And some of those cases I know have stayed with you.
Yes. I don't think you ever forget them. So I was actually, you know, thinking about it in the lead up to coming in and doing the session. I mean, one was of a young girl. She was in the morgue in Melbourne. She would have been 12 or 13 and she'd killed herself with a .22 rifle. And the bruising behind one of her eyes in particular was just it looked like eyeshadow. It was just so beautiful. But of course, I realised what 12-year-old is shooting themselves. There's obviously some pretty sinister stuff going on. No doubt, you know, sexual abuse is a high likely contender. So that one stuck with me. There was another guy who'd lost his job, I think, in West Heidelberg. And he took his whole head off with a very high caliber firearm and, you know, sprayed it all over the room. And the really challenging thing was that the local cop from that district knew the family really well, and they were working incredibly hard, physically hard, to keep the two brothers from getting into that room because they knew that if those brothers saw that crime scene, they would never unsee it. You know, as can't I, you know. And it really showed to me what fantastic people police are. In most cases, you know, doing such enormously important work for society, trying to protect these chaps from what is already a horrific day. So, yeah, lots of blokes who've shot their wife, mostly pathetic. Sometimes they stabbed the wife to death and then shot themselves. You know, you go past the bedroom, you're in their home. It's, you know, they're in their lounge room or the bedroom, and you go past the Michael Jackson posters in the kids' bedroom doors open, and it's sort of heartbreaking, but, you know, at the time you really just steel yourself for the work that you're doing. I got to the point where I used to see the job, that part of the job in particular, as being effectively community service, that there were clearly very few people who could do what I was doing. by nature of the number of people who'd come into the team and then just couldn't stump it up. And so, I felt, quietly proud of myself for being able to do this work. And, the community needed the work done.
Those people, the people whose families had been torn apart by these crimes, they were never the same again. But in the days that you were working, there was no talk of PTSD. I mean, you talk about never being able to unsee things, and that's what we say these days. But in those days, that wasn't something that people said, was it?
No, absolutely. And in fact, there was this sort of distorted bravado. I know one of the guys I think he was in the ballistics, he might have been in the crime scene team, a copper, and he just had this absolutely ghoulish photo album of things, and they had, really weird before and after photos of people who'd been, really horrendously physically assaulted. And it was, I found that really, really creepy. But at the same time, it also really played into that reality where you'd come back from a horrible crime scene and you couldn't really even talk to anyone because the coppers didn't really want to talk about it because they weren't sharing their own lived experience. And I wasn't a member of the police force, so I'm not even in their team sort of thing. I'm just out on the periphery. But obviously it was, taking its toll though. That is for sure.
And did you ever talk about that kind of thing with the other scientists?
Well, look, it was really interesting. So there was really only Peter, Ross and myself doing this work day in, day out, week in, week out. And yes, Peter and I spoke openly and freely and well about all of this. So that was really healthy. Very few other people in the lab were going to crime scenes hardly ever. They were just not turning up. They were more likely to be the recipient of bagged items coming through the liaison system. And, then you go sort of to drugs and blood alcohol and they're sort of further degrees removed again. So, I did talk with Peter and the more senior managers. They were weirdly completely absent from all of the science. So, there was a cohort of 4 or 5 come to mind who were the sort of the key scientists of the time when the lab was being developed and getting some traction and getting some momentum. But they didn't ever maintain it. So like once they got to be managers, they sort of kept as far away from the real science, the forensic work, as they possibly could. So there was a very much what I saw as a very significant gulf between the people who were meant to be the more senior, experienced members of the lab. And in fact, as time goes on, you realise, well, actually, they weren't the more experienced because they hardly did any casework, real casework in the day. So, it was really, the groundbreakers like Peter Ross, who, was devising systems and scientific approaches at the coalface, and of which I also worked on, that was taking this field forward in Victoria.
And one last question about holding the hands of angry and violent suspects. Were men, and I think it was always men who had killed their wives, how were they at the crime scene?
Yeah, look, so sometimes they were dead as well. So sometimes they've killed their wife and then they kill themselves. But, where you did have a survivor who'd murdered their wife. So with the armed robbers and the like, they were, hardened criminals and they still had this they were still almost fizzling with anger and, energy. Whereas for these guys who'd murdered their wives, they were just like a balloon with a pinprick. They were just saggy. They were just completely drained, completely empty. They were no longer indignant about the alleged affair they thought the wife was having or whatever else it was. They were just, the most pathetic people I think I ever had the misfortune to have to spend time on the planet with. They were just terrible.
So, Maggie, we've been talking about these armed robbery and shooting cases that you've worked on, but you also worked on the kind of case that often ends up in a crime novel, specifically an Agatha Christie crime novel. It's a 1984 case where one person murdered another using arsenic. What can you tell us about that?
I was involved in what was quite a high-profile case in its day. It involved a chap called John Leonard Moss, who lived in Eaglehawk, Bendigo, married to his wife Lorraine. And my first involvement was when Jack Jacobs, who was a detective with the homicide squad, came into the lab with a bag full of odds and sods, all sorts of things in a big plastic bag that he'd collected from the Moss family home. John Moss had been ill for some time, and he, very ill, diarrhoea and all sorts of other medical ailments, and no one could sort of put the finger on it because this illness seemed, from what I understood at the time, would come and go. And it's important to understand that we didn't get a lot of background from homicide or other detectives when they've got a case like this going forward, because they don't want to lead us down a path where we're then just going to try and prove what their belief of the case is. So, and Jack, he had a nickname of the Magpie because he was always gathering information, gathering evidence. And I remember Peter Ross saying to him, no, Jack, we don't need all of that. So, yes, we had this bag of material and I took that case on and I analysed it, and one of the containers contained lead arsenate. So we had discrete crystals of lead arsenate, which is poison. It's arsenic in a lead salt. It's also used, though, in rose growing to keep pests at bay. And this fellow, John Moss, was an avid rose grower up Bendigo Way, no doubt a very good climate for it. So I've said to Jack Jacobs, I said, yes, I've got this is lead arsenate. But all that really does is show that there's this poison in the family home that can have a very legitimate application as well. And this would have been a time when nobody would have been collecting stats on who's going to the equivalent of Bunnings back in the mid-80s and picking up lead arsenate salt. So what flowed from that was that Jack Jacobs then wanted me to go to their family home and search for further evidence that would tie the wife of John Moss, Lorraine, to somehow be using this arsenic salt. And, we now know that we've established she had access to it, but what could we do to help Jack Jacobs? That's what he was wanting to know, to demonstrate that she not only had access, but she was using this arsenic material in food prep for her husband. And it's worth noting, I think there was a couple of other guys. Sometimes Moss wouldn't eat his lunch. He'd said he didn't taste good and he'd sort of hand it around and, hungry boys, they're just like, yeah, well, I'll have that, John, sort of thing. So, and there were a couple of guys who I think got sick as well, but obviously not as sick as John Moss.
So on this occasion, Maggie, you then went to the house. This must have been probably the only time you've ever done an investigation with a suspect actually watching you.
Yes, I think that's right, because I've certainly been to many homes, inside homes, but virtually every instance there were the deceased as a result of shootings. This was very much a different case. And as you say, very Agatha Christie-esque in its sort of setup. So I went up to their house, the family home, and I went with Detective Jacobs, which even of itself was intriguing because normally we would go under our own steam. But I remember going with Jack and we get to the house and I'm sort of let in and the wife, Lorraine Moss, is there. And one of the daughters, I think there were 2 or 3 daughters, and one of the daughters, maybe 2, was sort of hovering in the background as well. It was very weird. I sort of wished and kept wishing that she was just held down at the local police station or something. I found it very unsettling to have her there. And she was just chatting on as though we were, making scones together for afternoon tea. It was quite bizarre, given the premise for which I was in her home. And she was literally hovering behind me, looking over my shoulder. And I'd already worked out, I'd had a long conversation with Peter Ross about where we can take this. And really what we're looking for is anything that demonstrates the lead arsenate being present in an environment where you wouldn't expect it. So, and access for the wife to be using it as a form of poison. So what I did was I went into the kitchen, and as kitchens with tiles in the day before the, slabs of marble and stainless steel era that many kitchens have now, there's all these tiles with a lot of grout, and the grout has this sort of build-up of a sort of greasy deposit. You know, it doesn't matter how much cleanser you might use, you're still going to have this stuff sort of lying around. So I used a scalpel and I'm scraping this gunk out from the back of the sink and putting them in vials. All the while, Lorraine is asking me, "Oh, and what's that for?" And blah, blah, blah. And I was also really mindful, like, I shouldn't be telling you what I'm doing. You've got no right to have access to this information. But anyway, I think I would have just kept it fairly high level and said, "Oh, I'm just here to take some samples. Take some samples. And then the other thing I was asked to collect was pillowcases that were from the bedroom of Mr. and Mrs. Moss. And one of them in particular had a bit of a stain, which I think was a residual stain of a time where he'd vomited. So I think it had been laundered. I mean, I'm sure it was vomit. It wasn't, like fresh vomit. But that was all a bit strange too, to be honest. So, you just bundle this stuff up and then, back to town and analysis. And the analysis showed, again, discrete flakes containing both lead and arsenic. So in all likelihood, the same material that was in one of those plastic tubs that I'd identified that was found in the kitchen. Now, it's very unlikely that anyone using material like that is a known poison would be using it in the kitchen. It's not a safe practice at all, particularly when he had a garden shed which had, water plumbed in and this and that. So it was of moment, I think, that we found those discrete particles, that I was able to identify that.
And you were also asked to search the kitchen at a hospital where Mr. Moss had been for a while.
Yes, so there was an added layer of his medical journey that even whilst he was in the Austin Hospital in Heidelberg, he was continuing to get ill. Jack Jacobs was of the mind that perhaps Lorraine Moss was still poisoning her husband. She was bringing in food from home and, was there any chance of finding some residue in the hospital setting that would, pretty categorically rule out the Rose pesticide treatment theory.
So you collected all this evidence. What was the next stage?
Remembering that some of the judicial processes are sort of outside of my purvey, but in July 1986, Lorraine Moss was charged with murder, and the murder charge was heard by the coroner. John Leonard Moss had passed away by this time. So it was a coronial inquest where it was clear that, yes, lead arsenate was present in the kitchen, in a food prep area, and even though Detective Jacobs felt that it was, categorically evidence that should link the wife to the death of her husband, that was not the finding of that inquiry. It was, he conceded that there was some suspicion in the case, and that suspicion was not evidence per se. So that was sort of the end of that. But there was also conversations in the family that I certainly was not privy to at the time. And it seemed that Mrs. Moss was talking about the potential for her having been involved in her husband's death with one of her daughters.
So the coroner decided not to charge Lorraine with murder. Did you have any kind of feeling about that result?
Look, I think one of the benefits of being a good forensic scientist is that I didn't have feelings about it particularly. I was very comfortable with the work that I'd done. I was very confident that the lead arsenate was in the kitchen. I knew through Detective Jacobs that Moss had passed away. But if the coroner wasn't prepared to commit Moss's wife to trial for murder, that's not my decision to make. My opportunity and the work that I do is for the community to ensure the highest quality scientific work is available for the courts. I mean, Jack Jacobs was very disappointed, obviously, and we know of that. But what I felt was, oh, well, this is this, that's that. I can't do anything further. And I frankly just thought that was the end of it until there was a call out of the blue. I'd actually left forensic science by this stage, and out of the blue I was required to go and give evidence again.
And in 2002, you found yourself back in court.
That's right. And of course, none of my evidence had changed substantially. So it was still focusing on the reality that lead arsenate salt was detected in the kitchen of the family home where Lorraine Moss, and I think she'd remarried by this time, where she had been preparing food for her husband who had passed away in the mid-80s from arsenic poisoning. So my evidence was effectively the same, but there was additional information coming forward from the family.
At the time, back in 1984, you noted the presence of the daughters when you were investigating, and one of the daughters was crucial in this reopening of the case.
That's what I learnt after the fact, effectively, because, as I say, it didn't inform my evidence or my findings. But I think what it did was that, look, my evidence, I think, provided a very solid anchor point for which the homicide squad to take their case back to the court, or the cold case team in this matter. And it was value added or enhanced by the words, an alleged confession by Lorraine Moss, now Lorraine White, to one of the daughters that she had murdered their father. And that daughter wasn't able to keep a lid on that, and she went and spoke to the police.
So, Maggie, your early career meant you faced some pretty extraordinary situations when you were barely an adult. Have those experiences had an influence on the person that you are today, some 40 years later?
Yeah, they certainly have. I remember when I first left forensic, and it was bittersweet. I remember crying at the farewell speech because a lot of me really enjoyed the work and would have liked to have stayed. When I left, I was going off call, which was leaving all of that responsibility back on the team leader, Peter Ross. And, it took some time for me to not respond to the microwave ding, which had a similar pitch to the pager, and not just be, at ready for the next, war scene sort of situation. So that certainly impacted me. But I think also I'd, just like the listeners to understand that there were myriad reasons why I moved on. And one of them was I'd started what I considered was a very unhealthy habit of reading funeral notices for the deceased whose cases I was embroiled in, and even talking to you about it now. Like, I don't think I've spoken to anyone about it, and I feel really a bit unsettled because I just know that's a very slippery slope. That's not a good place to be. And I just thought, well, I can't stay here. I need to go. So luckily I was, able to pick up a really interesting job as the next role along. But of course it stays with you. It's impossible not to. I can still visualise myself in any number of crime scenes where there's dead people around. I feel incredibly proud of the work I did in that time. It's a great conversation starter, great CV dot point, and I'm using it to other ends now as well in the form of creative fiction writing work that I've just started.
So, Maggie, you joined the lab in 1982. You left in 1987. Why was that?
I'd also become romantically involved with Peter Ross, who was my manager. At the early stages, he was also married to another woman, so it was a very complex space and not easy to navigate. But I also knew that if our relationship had any chance of really surviving, it wasn't going to be there. So I've, talked about the, starting to read these death notices, being on call half my life, Peter's on call the other half. It was not an easy time. We couldn't really have much us time. So I think it was the right call. And I also knew that Peter's expertise in forensic science, and I'm not, selling myself down the road. I was a very effective and efficient operator. But forensic science is Peter's life. We jokingly, our daughter and I call it his first wife. And so leaving it was the right thing to do. And in fact, last week we celebrated our 36th wedding anniversary. So that's pretty cool.
Congratulations for that, Maggie. And thanks again for coming to speak to us.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Liz. It's great to be able to, remind myself of this work that I've done previously, and for you to be shining a really important light on the role of forensics in the criminal justice system. So thank you.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Jade Murray and Dan Mullins. Sound design is by Niall Fernandez. This podcast is produced on Wurundjeri and Gadigal lands.